The most dangerous form of control in modern dating is not manipulation, arguments, or ultimatums. It's silence. Not the kind of silence that comes from distance, but the silence that moves you. She doesn't raise her voice. She doesn't demand anything. She doesn't even explain herself. And yet, you start changing. You check your phone more. You overthink your words. You adjust your behavior. You wait. That's how control works now. Modern dating has shifted from direct power to psychological influence. Control is no longer enforced. It is felt. And the men who fall into it rarely realize what's happening until they've already lost their emotional center. Here's the uncomfortable truth. She doesn't control you by doing something. She controls you by withholding something. Attention, warmth, consistency, validation. And when those things disappear without explanation, your nervous system goes into repair mode. You try to restore balance. You replay interactions. You question yourself. You unconsciously move toward her emotionally, not because you want to, but because your system is seeking relief. That is the dark side of modern dating. Control is no longer loud. It's subtle, and it feels like attraction. Most men believe they are being patient, understanding, or emotionally mature. In reality, they are being emotionally guided by silence, inconsistency, and selective attention. They think they are choosing, but they are reacting. And reaction is where power shifts. This video will show you how women can control men without saying a single word, why this dynamic is so effective in modern dating, and how emotional influence replaces direct manipulation. You'll understand why you feel pulled, unsettled, and off-center even when nothing obvious has happened. Because control today doesn't come from force, it comes from emotional leverage. And emotional leverage is created the moment your emotional stability becomes dependent on someone else's behavior. If you've ever felt calmer when she replied, more anxious when she didn't, more invested when she pulled away, this video is about you. Not to blame women, not to shame men, but to expose a dynamic most people are living inside without awareness. Because the moment you see how control actually works, it stops working on you. Stay with me. Because once you understand this mechanism, you'll never feel emotionally guided by silence again. And that changes how dating feels forever. Before we start, a quick reminder. The real transformation doesn't happen on YouTube. It happens inside the community. If these videos have opened your eyes, what's inside will rebuild your mindset completely. It's not just a course, it's a brotherhood, a private space where men master attraction, emotional control, and the psychology of power. You don't join for a month, you join for life. Every future course, book, and lesson is yours forever. No subscriptions, no limits. Just one decision that changes your direction. If you're serious about growth, discipline, and purpose, click the link below. Join the community. Enroll once, grow forever. Let's dive in. Section 1. How silence becomes emotional leverage in modern dating. Silence becomes emotional leverage the moment your nervous system starts responding to it. Not logically, automatically. That's what makes it so powerful. No words are required. No intention even needs to be proven. The effect happens before thought. In modern dating, silence is rarely accidental. It doesn't have to be planned to be effective. All it needs is your emotional attention. When communication is inconsistent, your nervous system starts filling in gaps. You search for meaning. You scan for signs. You try to interpret tone, timing, and absence. And in doing so, your emotional center quietly shifts away from yourself and toward her behavior. That shift is leverage. Leverage forms when one person's internal state starts depending on another person's actions. The more your calm, confidence, and self-assurance fluctuate based on her presence or absence, the more power silence gains. Here's the key point most men miss. Silence does not control you because it is cold. It controls you because it creates uncertainty. Uncertainty activates the nervous system. The nervous system hates unresolved patterns. It wants closure, balance, and predictability. When those are removed, it pushes you toward action. Not action based on strength, but action based on relief. That's why you feel the urge to check your phone. That's why you replay conversations. That's why you soften boundaries. That's why you move emotionally without being asked. Nothing was demanded, but something was taken and you moved to restore it. This is why silence is more powerful than confrontation. Confrontation gives clarity. Silence creates ambiguity, and ambiguity keeps you engaged far longer than certainty ever could. In modern dating, leverage is rarely about dominance. It's about who adapts first. The moment you adapt emotionally to her silence, the dynamic tilts. She doesn't need to say, "I need space." She doesn't need to say, "I'm unsure." She doesn't need to say anything at all. Your nervous system does the work for her. And here's the part that makes this dark. Most men mistake this internal reaction for attraction. They think the pull they feel is desire growing. In reality, it's emotional imbalance forming. Desire feels expansive. Leverage feels contracting. One gives energy, the other drains it. When silence becomes leverage, you stop choosing consciously. You start responding reflexively. You become emotionally adjustable. And adjustable men are easy to guide without instruction. This is not about blaming women. Many don't even realize they're doing this. Silence is a learned regulation strategy. When it works once, the nervous system remembers it. But once you understand how silence becomes leverage, something changes immediately. You stop personalizing absence. You stop chasing relief. You stop filling gaps with your own energy. And the moment you stop responding internally, silence loses its power because leverage only exists where reaction exists. And that leads directly to the next layer of control, where attention itself becomes a tool. Section 2. Why inconsistent attention is more addictive than affection. Affection soothes. Inconsistent attention hooks. That is the uncomfortable reality of modern dating psychology. The human nervous system does not bond strongest to what feels good consistently. It bonds strongest to what feels unpredictable. And unpredictability is exactly what inconsistent attention creates. When attention is steady, your system relaxes. There is nothing to chase, nothing to interpret, nothing to fix. Attraction can grow, but it does not hijack your focus. You remain centered. When attention is inconsistent, your nervous system does the opposite. It sharpens, it scans, it waits. You don't feel calm, you feel alert, and alertness feels like intensity. Intensity feels like chemistry. Chemistry feels like attraction, but what's actually happening is emotional conditioning. Inconsistent attention works like a variable reward system. Sometimes she's warm, sometimes she's distant, sometimes she's present, sometimes she disappears. Your brain starts associating relief with her return. The absence creates tension. The return releases it. That cycle is addictive, not because she is special, but because your nervous system is being trained. This is why men often feel more attached to women who confuse them than to women who treat them well. The attachment is not built on connection. It is built on relief-seeking. You are not drawn to her. You are drawn to the moment when uncertainty ends, and the more that cycle repeats, the more power it gains. Your focus narrows, your standards soften, your boundaries blur. You start tolerating things you never would have accepted at the beginning, not because you want to, but because your system wants the next emotional release. This is how control deepens without words. She doesn't need to demand loyalty. She doesn't need to test you openly. She doesn't need to compete. Inconsistent attention keeps you engaged automatically. And the most dangerous part is this. You begin to confuse emotional stimulation with emotional value. You tell yourself she matters more because she affects you more. In reality, she affects you more because the dynamic is unstable. Stability feels boring when your system is conditioned to chaos. This is why men often lose themselves slowly in modern dating. There is no clear moment where control is handed over. It happens through repetition, through silence followed by warmth, distance followed by attention, confusion followed by relief. The man who understands this pattern stops calling it attraction. He calls it what it is: emotional leverage. And once you label it correctly, it begins to lose its grip. Because real attraction does not destabilize your sense of self. It does not require you to wait, wonder, or chase emotional equilibrium. Real attraction expands you. Leverage contracts you. The men who break free from this dynamic do not fight for attention. They stop responding to inconsistency internally. They do not punish silence or reward crumbs. They return their nervous system to neutrality, and neutrality is what collapses leverage completely, because inconsistent attention only works on a system that is still hoping. Once hope is replaced by self-rust, the dynamic changes instantly. And that brings us to the next layer of control, where boundaries start dissolving quietly without confrontation. Section 3. How emotional control makes you abandon your boundaries without noticing. The most effective form of control is the one that doesn't need to be enforced. No arguments, no ultimatums, no conflict. Your boundaries don't get crossed loudly. They fade quietly. And the reason you don't notice is because you believe you're choosing. This is how it happens. At the beginning, you have standards. You know what feels acceptable. You know what doesn't. You know how you want to be treated. But once silence, inconsistency, and emotional uncertainty enter the dynamic, your nervous system shifts priorities. It stops asking, "Is this aligned with my values?" and starts asking, "How do I restore emotional balance?" That shift is where boundaries dissolve. You answer messages faster than you want to. You tolerate gaps in communication you wouldn't accept from others. You excuse behavior you would normally question. You lower expectations without ever saying it out loud, not because you decided to, because your system is trying to reduce discomfort. This is the hidden mechanism. Emotional control does not force you to cross your boundaries. It reframes crossing them as relief. Each time you compromise internally, you feel a momentary sense of calm. The tension eases, the uncertainty softens, and your nervous system learns that self-abandonment brings short-term peace. That learning repeats over time. Your boundaries don't disappear. They become flexible, then optional, then invisible. And the most dangerous part is that you still feel like you're being rational. You tell yourself you're being patient. You tell yourself you're being understanding. You tell yourself it's not a big deal. But what's really happening is that your internal reference point has shifted. You are no longer measuring behavior against your standards. You are measuring it against how it makes you feel emotionally in the moment. This is how emotional control replaces self-respect without confrontation. Once boundaries dissolve internally, control no longer needs to be applied externally. You regulate yourself, you adapt, you adjust, and the dynamic runs on autopilot. This is why men often look back and wonder how they tolerated situations they would have rejected instantly at the start. There was no single moment where they gave up their power. It happened through small emotional concessions made in silence. The solution is not to become rigid or defensive. It is to restore your internal reference point, to stop using emotional relief as a guide, to stop letting uncertainty dictate behavior. Men who break free from emotional control do not suddenly assert boundaries aggressively. They simply stop abandoning them quietly. They stop responding internally to silence. They stop rewarding inconsistency with access. They return to emotional neutrality, and neutrality restores clarity. When your nervous system is calm, boundaries reappear naturally. You no longer need to enforce them. You embody them. And when boundaries are embodied, control has nowhere to attach. This is the moment the dynamic begins to reverse. Because the moment you stop adjusting yourself to maintain connection, the connection must either adjust to you or collapse. And that leads us to the next critical stage where control either breaks completely or escalates into something more obvious. Section 4. The moment control breaks and why she feels it instantly. Control breaks the moment your emotional reactions stop feeding the dynamic, not when you confront it, not when you explain yourself, not when you demand change. It breaks when your nervous system disengages from the push-pull. This moment is quiet. There is no announcement, no declaration, no visible power move from the outside. Nothing looks different. But internally, everything shifts. You stop checking your phone with urgency. You stop interpreting silence as meaning. You stop adjusting your behavior to restore emotional comfort. And the instant that happens, control loses its anchor. Because control in modern dating is not held through words or actions, it is held through emotional responsiveness. The moment you stop responding internally, leverage evaporates. She feels it immediately, not because she's analyzing you, not because she's tracking behavior consciously, but because the emotional feedback loop goes quiet. Her silence no longer produces movement in you. Her inconsistency no longer creates tension. Her attention no longer determines your state. That absence of reaction creates a vacuum, and humans are extremely sensitive to vacuums in emotional dynamics. This is why when control breaks, behavior often changes suddenly. She may reappear more clearly, she may test again, she may escalate warmth, or she may withdraw completely. All of these responses come from the same place: loss of leverage. Leverage requires participation. When one side stops playing emotionally, the dynamic must reorganize. There is no middle ground. Men often expect control to break with dominance or distance. In reality, it breaks with indifference to outcome. Not cold indifference, calm indifference, the kind that comes from emotional self-rust, not bitterness. This is why chasing never breaks control, and punishing rarely does. Both are reactions. Both feed the loop. Even anger confirms investment. Even withdrawal done to provoke response keeps the system alive. The only thing that breaks control is neutrality. Neutrality removes drama. Neutrality removes urgency. Neutrality removes reward. And without reward, conditioning collapses. Once control breaks, one of two things happens. Either she feels the shift and moves toward clarity because the dynamic now feels unresolved in a different way, or she fades away because the connection no longer feeds emotional stimulation. Both outcomes are clarity, and clarity is freedom. This is where most men finally understand something critical. Control never belonged to her. It belonged to the part of you that reacted. Once that part goes quiet, the entire structure falls apart. And from that moment on, the dynamic no longer runs you. You run yourself. Which leads us to the final transformation where attraction becomes optional. Instead of controlling, Section 5. The identity shift that makes emotional control impossible forever. At the deepest level, emotional control only works on a man who is still negotiating his sense of self inside relationships. Not consciously, subtly. The moment your identity depends even slightly on being chosen, approved, or emotionally validated, control has an entry point. The final shift happens when that dependency disappears. This is not about becoming cold, detached, or unavailable. It is about relocating your emotional center. Instead of your sense of calm, confidence, and worth being influenced by how she behaves, it becomes anchored internally. Once that happens, no amount of silence, inconsistency, or withdrawal can move you. Identity always overrides tactics. As long as you are trying to handle control, you are still inside the dynamic. As long as you are trying to outplay silence or manage attention, you are reacting, and reaction is the soil where leverage grows. The men who cannot be controlled are not more strategic. They are emotionally self-referenced. They do not ask, "Why is she doing this to me?" They ask, "Does this dynamic align with who I am?" That single question changes everything. When your identity is grounded, silence stops feeling personal. Inconsistency stops feeling seductive. Attention stops feeling like currency. You no longer feel pulled to respond, prove, or restore balance. You simply observe. Observation without emotional charge is devastating to control because control needs urgency. It needs hope. It needs emotional hunger. When those disappear, the dynamic collapses on its own. This identity shift also changes how attraction feels. You stop mistaking intensity for connection. You stop confusing emotional stimulation with desire. You stop bonding to unpredictability. Instead, you feel drawn to clarity, consistency, and mutual presence. And that changes who stays in your life. Women who rely on leverage lose interest quickly. Women who value emotional steadiness lean in naturally. This is not something you perform. It is something you become. Once your identity is stable, you no longer fear losing her because losing yourself is no longer an option. And paradoxically, that is what makes you most attractive. Not because you are hard to control, but because there is nothing to control. Your emotions are yours. Your attention is yours. Your center stays with you. And once that happens, the dark side of modern dating loses all its power over you. Because control only exists where identity is still being negotiated. When identity is settled, the game ends. Section 6. Why control feels like attraction, and why most men confuse the two. One of the most dangerous illusions in modern dating is mistaking control for attraction. This confusion is what keeps men emotionally stuck long after the dynamic has stopped serving them, and it happens because control feels intense while healthy attraction often feels calm. Intensity is not desire. Intensity is nervous system activation. When silence unsettles you, when inconsistency sharpens your focus, when unpredictability keeps you alert, your body mistakes that heightened state for emotional connection. Your heart feels involved. Your thoughts loop. Your attention narrows. And the mind labels that experience as attraction. But what you're feeling is not closeness. It's emotional imbalance. Control creates tension. Tension creates focus. Focus creates attachment. That attachment feels powerful, but it is not rooted in mutual interest. It is rooted in unresolved emotional loops. The brain bonds to what it cannot predict because it wants resolution. This is why men often feel more attached to women who pull away than to women who stay present. Presence soothes the nervous system. Withdrawal activates it. And an activated nervous system feels alive. But alive does not mean aligned. This is where control becomes addictive. Each time she withdraws, your system spikes. Each time she returns, you feel relief. That relief reinforces the cycle. Your body starts associating her presence with emotional regulation, and once that association forms, control no longer needs to be applied consciously. You regulate yourself around her. This is why logic fails in these situations. Friends can tell you she's inconsistent. You can see red flags clearly, and yet emotionally, you remain hooked because the attachment is not cognitive. It is physiological. Control hijacks the body first. The mind follows later. Real attraction works differently. Attraction expands you. Control contracts you. Attraction brings clarity. Control brings confusion. Attraction does not require you to abandon your boundaries. Control slowly convinces you that boundaries are obstacles. Men who escape this trap do not harden their hearts. They sharpen their awareness. They learn to distinguish between emotional stimulation and emotional alignment. They stop asking, "Why do I feel so drawn to her?" and start asking, "What state does this dynamic keep me in?" That question is liberating. If the dynamic keeps you anxious, waiting, overthinking, and self-adjusting, it is not attraction. It is leverage, and leverage always costs more than it gives. Once you understand this, your response changes naturally. You stop chasing intensity. You stop rewarding inconsistency. You stop confusing emotional highs with emotional truth. And when that happens, control loses its grip, because control only works when it can hide inside attraction. Once you separate the two, the spell breaks, and that prepares you for the final shift where you no longer need to fight control at all. You simply stop participating in it. In short, she never controlled you with words. She controlled you with your reactions. Silence only had power because your nervous system responded to it. Inconsistency only mattered because it disrupted your emotional balance. Attention only became leverage because part of you was still waiting for it to feel complete. That is the dark truth of modern dating. Control does not come from manipulation. It comes from emotional dependency without awareness. The moment your calm depended on her replies, you lost ground. The moment your confidence rose and fell with her attention, leverage formed. The moment you adjusted yourself to restore emotional comfort, boundaries dissolved. And none of it required her to say a word. But the moment you stopped reacting internally, everything changed. Silence lost its meaning. Inconsistency lost its pull. Attention lost its power. Not because you became cold or distant, but because you became self-referenced. Your emotional center returned to you. Your identity stopped negotiating. Your nervous system stopped chasing relief. That is when control breaks. From that place, attraction either becomes real or irrelevant. Women who relied on leverage feel unsettled and drift away. Women who value emotional steadiness feel safe and lean in. Either way, the confusion ends. This is the level where modern dating stops feeling dark and starts feeling clear. You no longer try to be chosen. You no longer fear silence. You no longer confuse intensity with connection. You see dynamics for what they are, and once seen, they cannot control you again. The dark side of modern dating only works in the shadows, and now it has nowhere left to hide. Remember, knowledge means nothing without action. If you're ready to rise above emotion and lead with purpose, join the community today at the link below. Enroll once,